I refer to the way that the Chinese government uses the power of its economy to shape the decision making of governments and companies and individuals around the world to bring them more in line with the Chinese Communist Party's core interests. I call this authoritarian economic statecraft. And one major point in my book is that the way to push back against this is through building a democratic economic statecraft. Because prior to a few years ago, the way that we thought about this was that there wasn't really a role for government to push back against this. If a company, decides to censor its own employees or decides, to adhere to Chinese government censorship directives, there's nothing that the US government can do about that. Governments can't act on that. It has to be civil society action. All we can do is a consumer boycott, or we can have a hashtag. We can name and shame. But it's been proven time and time again that naming and shaming and consumer boycotts are not nearly enough to change the behavior of U.S. companies, because the massive monetary incentives they get from the Chinese market vastly make up for that, for whatever kind of reputational harm they might suffer temporarily in the U.S. market. But more importantly, I think, than even just from a pragmatic standpoint, is that it's not the job of CEOs to uphold our political principles. That's the job of a government. I think that with the embrace of what I in the book call neoliberalism, this idea that free markets are the same thing as democracy. It's not just that free markets lead to democracy, is that they are in fact the same thing. And that's just what we have learned in the past 30 years, is that is simply not true. You can have a capitalist country that is very authoritarian. And I think what we have to do is restore the idea that it is a government's job to defend political principles, and that it's putting CEOs on a kind of a moral pedestal to say that they should willingly sacrifice hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue for free speech, when we don't make those demands upon ourselves. So functionally speaking, what should we do? I have 14 recommendations in my book how to address this issue domestically, and then more recommendations about how to address this in a multilateral way. And I'll just highlight a few from each. So multilaterally, a suggestion that is, I didn't come up with it, but I do support it very much, is the idea of creating something like an economic NATO. You can call it a mutual economic defense pact. You can call it an economic Article 5, whatever. The idea that a group of like-minded countries agree in advance that if one of their sectors or their country overall is targeted by China's economic coercion, they will spring into action to help each other, to help to open their markets to products from the affected sector, perhaps to issue retaliatory tariffs or some kind of punitive measure against China for this, as a form of deterrent, and that this over time could help push back against the way that China kind of exports its authoritarianism. Domestically, in the U.S. case, it's very difficult to address this in some cases, because we do have a very polarized politics at this time. But I, really strongly recommend that the U.S. adopt campaign finance reform to reduce the power of corporate donations in our politics. I think that would be healthy for our society in many ways, but also very specifically on this issue. Or even introduce a public finance option, as many developed democracies have. Now, that's not a particularly realistic goal at this time, but I think in the long term, that's something that we should absolutely work towards. Something that is a little bit easier, and that I think would have a bipartisan support, is adopting FARA registries on the state level. So FARA is the Foreign Agents Registration Act, adopted in 1937, that requires people or companies who are operating on behalf of a foreign government or entity to try to influence the US national narrative, that they file mandatory public disclosures. It doesn't forbid that activity. it just brings transparency to it. So we know who's lobbying on behalf of a foreign power. But that only exists at the federal level. There are no state FARA registries. So back to the question of subnational engagement, foreign government lobbying, or the lobbying by foreign government affiliated entities on the state level, there are no registries for that. There's no transparency around that. And I think that adopting FARA registries on a state by state level would be, I mean, it's just a win. It's a win-win all around. It's transparency. It doesn't actually prohibit anything. And it just makes American citizens and voters more informed.